Good morning, everyone. Welcome back to the continuation of your PowerPoint notes. When we left off, we had talked about Japanese internment and the turning points in the war. One thing I want to lead off with that is not in your notes is the turning point for the Americans. We had talked yesterday about the Battle of Stalingrad and how that was considered a turning point for the war. That is true, and so is the Battle of Midway in the Pacific, but I think more importantly, the Battle of D-Day was for a turning point for specifically the American Army. Operation Overlord took place June 6, 1944, and it was the amphibious invasion of France. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and a lot of Americans lost their lives. If you're looking for a good visual representation of that, the very opening scene of the movie Saving Private Ryan is phenomenal at depicting the horrors that took place on that beach that day. And all the scenes were actually taken from written documentation from soldiers that were there. All that would lead to our ability to continue the war in Europe. We had tried to go through northern France, but were stopped by the mountainous terrain. The Russians had started pushing in from the east, and now it was the Americans' turn. As we pushed further and further, the German army fought harder and harder, but ultimately we were able to win. The Allied plan for the victory was to strangle the Germans. It was successful. Eventually, the Allied forces, the Russians, the Americans, and the British, cut off all the supplies containing the German army in Central Europe. The official victory day is May 7th, 1945. And if you're following along with your notes, that is the Victory in Europe slide. May 7th, 1945, Victory in Europe Day. It was a huge day in American history and set aside us as a world power when we were able to beat Germany. And as you can see, there are a couple pictures of a very happy soldier and a woman kissing with the newspaper that says Germany surrenders. The war in Europe has ended. This is the New York Times. Their surrender was unconditional. And then, as you can see, the headline says, VE Day will be proclaimed today. Our troops on Okinawa gain. So the war in Europe ended, but the war in the Pacific would not end for a few months after. To hit on this point of how excited were Americans and how there's a really famous picture of an American navalman kissing a nurse in the middle of Times Square. What's interesting about that photo is that they didn't know each other, and the Navymen didn't really ask permission for that. So it's kind of a sleazy picture, but it does show the excitement that the Americans had. This video is going to be a little bit shorter, as you can see if you're following along with your notes and your slides. There's only a few slides left. But as I said, the war in Japan would continue until Japan would surrender. In the end in Japan, after FDR passed away, Truman becomes president. FDR, who had been president since 1932, is now dead, and Truman steps in. He now understands that Japan has to be dealt with harsh, and so he's going to order some crazy ideas. The Allies had taken a large part of the Japanese territory already, and the Japanese people were ready to surrender, but only under the terms the emperor remained in power. So the American idea had been island hopping, going from one island, taking it, and then going to another, and then taking that, and then that was slowly moving our way towards the mainland of Japan. The Japanese people did want surrender, but they thought that it should be on the emperor's terms, and this was true for the military elite that were ruling Japan instead of the emperor. The emperor was still the head of the state, but he was making no military decisions. Instead, it was one or two military officials. Um, and they had no plans for surrender. In fact, that they told every citizen to sharpen a stick and prepare for the invasion of mainland Japan. So the military elite had no interest in surrender, and that's probably true for the a large portion of the population. Japan had never surrendered in all of its military history. They had never lost a war. They had never been invaded and lost, and they had never been invaded ever. They had never faced surrender. And so now they were a population that did not know how to surrender, did not know really what that meant, and they were very proud people and would want to fight tooth and nail to the end. Um, the estimation for the total casualties that we would have sustained invading mainland Japan would have been well over 1 million American lives gone. And they believe that over 10 million Japanese citizens would have been killed, either by suicide or by attacking Americans or other allied forces. So this was going to be a tough task no matter what. The Allies had a huge decision to make. Truman, who is now president, takes over after the Manhattan Project has already been decided. The Manhattan Project, if you recall from popular culture, is the creating of the atomic bombs. And so Truman has the tough task of considering whether or not to deploy them. Do we stick to conventional warfare? And if so, how many lives are we going to lose? How many Americans are going to die to take Japan before they fully surrender? And if not, if we drop the bombs, how many civilians are we going to kill? How many bombs are we going to have to drop? And in the end, what are the repercussions of launching us into the atomic age? That's a lot to consider. But the war had to end, and Truman knew that the only way to do it was to be aggressive and to try and spare as many men as you could. So the Allies took part in. The United States wanted its unconditional surrender, including their own terms of potentially stepping down the emperor. Japan did not want this, so they were going to fight tooth and nail to the very end. The U.S. officials did warn Japan that utter destruction was going to happen if they did not surrender. The military, as we talked about, the military leaders did not care. They didn't think it was going to be possible. They didn't know what was going to happen. On August 6th, 1945, the atomic bomb is dropped on Hiroshima. The bomb hits its target dead on and destroys about 63% of the city. Well over 100,000 people would be killed or injured, and the effects would still be felt today in Hiroshima. Japan is in shock. The citizens are in shock, but the Japanese radio stations during this entire time would not stop telling people that that was nothing, and that if the Japanese citizens just held on, the victory would be sure. 3 days later, the Japanese still refusing to surrender, the U.S. dropped a second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. This one missed its initial target a little bit, but was still devastating. And as you can see from the pictures as you're following along with the PowerPoint, that cities were destroyed. The entire mushroom cloud is huge. This was a horrible event in military, and as Einstein once said, I do not know with what weapons World War III will be fought with, but I do know that World War IV will be fought with sticks and stones. He's referring to nuclear annihilation on both sides. So the war is over, Japan surrenders, and America is seen as the victorious party on both sides. We now become a world power, and we are going to have to maintain this fragile peace, launching us into the Cold War. Um, the the Russians had a plan to continue to march, basically continue the war and turn back and backstab the Americans in the British in the European theater. But what stopped them from marching their armies past Berlin all the way to the coast of France was the bombings, because they didn't know how many. Japan just thought, after Hiroshima, only thought we had one bomb. The reality is we had several, all of which were ready at a moment's notice to be dropped around the world. And we launch ourselves into the nuclear age, and we launch ourselves into the Cold War without even knowing it. And the lines would be drawn where World War II ends, Berlin. If you have, as always, if you have any questions, please email me or Mr. Webster. Or if you're Mr. Zeibert's class, please email Mr. Zeibert. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and see you all again soon. Bye.